April 14, 1912, 11:40 p.m. The Unsinkable. RMS Titanic has just struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic, while passengers above scramble in confusion, deep in the bowels of the ship, in a world of thundering machinery and scalding steam. 35 men are about to write one of history's most heroic chapters. Tonight, we descend into the heart of the Titanic, into her engine room, to witness the final hour of men who chose duty over life, who stayed at their posts while death rose around them, and whose sacrifice gave hundreds of others a chance to see another dawn. To understand their sacrifice, you must first understand what they protected. The Titanic wasn't just a ship, she was a floating city, and like any city, she needed power, constant, reliable power. Deep below the waterline, in a cathedral of steel and steam, 3 massive reciprocating engines dominated the landscape. Each one stood 4 stories tall, monuments to human engineering. The 2 outer engines, each generating 15,000 horsepower, drove the massive wing propellers. Between them, a smaller but equally crucial low-pressure turbine drove the central propeller. But engines need fuel, and fuel meant coal. Tons upon tons of coal, fed by an army of 176 firemen and coal trimmers working in shifts around the clock. These weren't just workers, they were the lifeblood of the ship, feeding the 29 boilers that generated the steam that powered everything. And crucially, electricity, for massive steam-driven dynamos generated the electrical power that lit every corridor, powered every elevator, and most importantly, on this night, kept the wireless radio working and the bilge pumps fighting the incoming flood. But at 11:40 p.m., this mechanical symphony was about to become a desperate battle against time and rising water. The collision felt different in the engine room than it did above. Passengers might have felt a slight shudder, a pause in the engines. But down here, in the mechanical heart of the ship, the impact resonated through steel and steam like a death knell. Chief Engineer Joseph Bell, a 50-year-old veteran who had served the White Star Line for decades, felt it immediately. The subtle change in vibration, the slight irregularity in the engine's rhythm. Something was wrong. Within minutes, the watertight doors began slamming shut, a thunderous final sound that sealed the fate of several compartments. But Bell and his men didn't know the extent of the damage yet. They didn't know that the ship had been mortally wounded. From the bridge, the engine order telegraph rang out. Fullest, the massive engines, which had been driving the ship forward at over 20 knots, suddenly had to reverse their tremendous momentum. The strain was enormous. Senior Second Engineer John Henry Hesketh, just 24 years old, was monitoring the electrical systems. The lights couldn't fail, not now. People needed to see to get to the lifeboats. Junior Third Engineer Herbert Harvey, only 35, was checking the integrity of the bulkheads, watching for any sign of water ingress. But in Boiler Room 6, the truth was already becoming horrifically clear. Boiler Room 6, the first 4 leading firemen, Frederick Barrett was in Boiler Room 6 when the impossible happened. Water, tons of freezing Atlantic seawater began pouring through the starboard side of the hull. "Get out! Everyone out!" Barrett shouted as the watertight door was already descending. He and Second Engineer Assistant John Shepard barely made it through, the massive steel door slamming shut behind them with a finality that sealed the fate of Boiler Room 6. But escaping Boiler Room 6 meant losing 1/6 of the ship's power generation. The steam pressure began dropping immediately. Bell, monitoring from his position, watched the gauges with growing alarm. The ship was wounded, and it was bleeding power. What Bell didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that the damage extended far beyond Boiler Room 6. The iceberg had opened the ship like a can opener, breaching compartments 1 through 6. The Titanic could survive flooding in 4 compartments. With 6 breached, she was already doomed. But the engineers didn't have time for despair. Their training, their duty, their code of honor, all demanded they fight, and fight they would, to the very end. The power struggle as midnight passed. The situation in the engine room became increasingly desperate. Water was rising in multiple compartments, but the electrical dynamos had to keep running. Without power, the ship would plunge into darkness. The wireless would die, and the pumps would stop. The bilge pumps were fighting a losing battle, but they were buying precious time. Every minute the pumps ran was another minute for the lifeboats to be loaded and lowered. Every minute the lights stayed on was another minute of hope for the 2,200 souls aboard. Junior Third Engineer Herbert Harvey was making increasingly frequent checks of the lower levels. The water was rising faster than the pumps could handle it. but the pumps had to keep running. Had to. What happened next demonstrates the incredible courage of these men. As water began entering Boiler Room 5, they could have evacuated, they should have evacuated, but they stayed. The remaining boilers had to maintain steam pressure. The dynamos had to keep generating electricity. These weren't just machines to them, they were lifelines for everyone above. At 12:15 a.m., Captain Smith gave the order to begin loading the lifeboats. Above deck, confusion reigned. Many passengers didn't believe the ship could sink, but below, in the engine room, there was no doubt about the gravity of the situation. The sound of water was getting closer, louder, more insistent. The rising tide. By 12:30 a.m., water had begun entering some of the lower engine room spaces. The situation was becoming untenable, but the engineers had made their choice. They would stay as long as the machinery could run. Chief Engineer Bell made a crucial decision. He ordered some of his younger engineers to the upper decks, not to abandon ship, but to help with the lifeboats. But he and his senior staff would remain. Someone had to tend the machinery. Someone had to keep the lights on. It was an agonizing choice for many of these young men. Their training, their pride, everything told them to stay with their machinery. But Bell's orders were clear. Go, help with the lifeboats. We'll manage here. Those who left would be among the very few engine room personnel to survive. Those who stayed would become legends. By 1 a.m., steam pressure was dropping noticeably. Boiler Room 4 was taking on water. The massive pumps were fighting against an ocean, and the ocean was winning. But still, the lights burned bright. Still, the wireless crackled with distress calls. Still, the pumps fought the flood. Senior wireless operator Jack Phillips was still sending distress calls, powered by the electricity these men were dying to maintain. Say, cool, then source. Come at once, we have struck a berg, sinking fast, ... double quotes. Every dot and dash of those messages was powered by the sacrifice of the men below. The final standby. 1:30 a.m. The engine room was partially flooded, but incredibly, impossibly, the main electrical dynamos were still running. The lights throughout the ship continued to burn, providing crucial illumination for the final lifeboat launches. Herbert Harvey, the young third engineer, was last seen checking the electrical systems in the lower engine room. The water was waist deep, but he remained at his post, ensuring the dynamos kept turning, the power kept flowing. Chief Engineer Bell, in his final hour, embodied everything the maritime service stood for: calm, professional, dedicated. As his world literally sank around him, he continued to monitor his systems, continued to coordinate his remaining men, continued to serve. At approximately 2:05 a.m., witnesses reported that the lights throughout the ship flickered and dimmed, but remarkably, they came back on. Someone below had managed to restore power. Someone was still fighting. The last lifeboats were in the water now. Collapsible C had been launched at 2:05 a.m. Collapsible D followed at 2:17 a.m. The deck was awash. The ship was beginning her final plunge. And then, at approximately 2:18 a.m., just 2 minutes before the Titanic made her final plunge, the lights finally failed. The dynamos, which had run faithfully through flood and chaos, finally succumbed to the rising water. In those final moments, 35 men stood in the darkness they had fought so hard to hold back, knowing they had done their duty to the very end. The mathematics of heroism, the numbers tell a story of incredible sacrifice. Of the 885 crew members aboard the Titanic, 673 perished, but among the engine room crew, the survival rate was heartbreakingly low. Of the 35 engineers, only 4 survived, and those were junior engineers who had been ordered to help with the lifeboats in the final hour. Of the 176 firemen and coal trimmers, only 48 survived. The engineering department had the lowest survival rate of any group on the ship. Chief Engineer Joseph Bell, age 50, Senior Second Engineer John Henry Hesketh, age 24, Junior Third Engineer Herbert Harvey, age 35, Senior Fourth Engineer William Parr, age 29, Fifth Engineer Jonathan Shepard, age 28. These weren't just statistics. These were fathers, sons, husbands, men with families waiting at home, with futures planned, with dreams unfulfilled, and they chose to give all of that up so that others might live. Their sacrifice wasn't symbolic, it was practical and life-saving. By maintaining power until 2:18 a.m., they kept the lights on for over 2.5 hours after the collision. Those lights enabled the loading and lowering of all 20 lifeboats. The continued operation of the wireless bringing rescue ships, the operation of the bilge pumps slowing the ship's sinking, and navigation lights that help lifeboats stay clear of the sinking ship. Without their sacrifice, the death toll would have been even more catastrophic. Their heroism didn't just inspire, it saved lives. The human cost when the rescue ship Carpathia arrived at dawn. She found 710 survivors huddled in lifeboats, many of them owing their lives to men they would never meet, whose names they would never know. One survivor testified, "The lights never went out until the very end. Even as the ship was going down, the electricity was still working. Someone down there was still doing their job." Joseph Bell left behind a wife and child. Herbert Harvey had recently gotten engaged. John Hesketh had just started his career with the White Star Line. These were real people with real lives, real hopes, real fears, but they were also something more. They were professionals who understood that their duty extended beyond their own survival. They were part of a tradition as old as seafaring itself, the tradition that says some things are more important than your own life. In the maritime world, there's a saying, the engineer goes down with the ship. It's not just tradition, it's a recognition that some responsibilities can't be abandoned, no matter the cost. On the night of April 14, 1912, 35 men proved that saying was more than words. It was a sacred trust. As water flooded the lower compartments, the engineers faced cascading failures. Each flooded boiler room meant less steam pressure. Less steam pressure meant less electrical power. Less electrical power meant dimmer lights, weaker pumps, dying communications. But they had options. They could redistribute steam flow, reroute electrical loads, balance the failing systems to maximize output for as long as possible. The technical heroism to fully appreciate their sacrifice. We need to understand the technical challenges they faced in those final hours. This wasn't just about staying with the ship, it was about managing incredibly complex systems under impossible conditions. The Titanic's power plant was a masterpiece of engineering. 29 boilers generated steam at 215 pounds per square inch. That steam drove not just the massive reciprocating engines, but also the 4 electrical dynamos that powered everything from lights to elevators to the crucial bilge pumps. This wasn't just courage, it was expertise applied under the most extreme conditions imaginable. When Boiler Room 6 flooded, they had to redirect steam from the remaining boilers. When water reached the dynamos, they had to decide which electrical systems to prioritize. Lights for the passengers, power for the pumps, current for the wireless. The answer was all of them, for as long as humanly possible. They chose not to choose. They chose to fight for everything until the very end. Every minute they kept the systems running required dozens of technical decisions. Steam pressure here, electrical load there, pump capacity calculations, structural stress assessments. They were engineering while drowning, calculating while dying, and they got it right. For 2 hours and 38 minutes, they got it right. The survivors burden among the handful of engine room survivors was Senior Assistant Second Engineer Walter Hurst. He had been ordered topside by Chief Engineer Bell in the final hour, one of the few engineers who lived to tell their story. Years later, Hurst recalled, "The chief told me to go help with the boats. I didn't want to leave. None of us wanted to leave, but orders were orders. I'll never forget looking back and seeing them still at their posts, still working. They saved my life by sending me away. And I've carried that with me every day since." The survivors carried more than just their memories. They carried the responsibility of telling the story, of making sure the world knew what happened in those flooded compartments, what choices were made, what prices were paid. The official inquiries praised their courage, but the survivors knew the words were inadequate. How do you explain the sound of machinery failing, the sight of water rising around electrical panels that had to keep running, the weight of choosing who lives and who dies? For the rest of their lives, the survivors would be asked the same questions. Why did they stay? Why didn't they save themselves? The answer was simple, even if the world found it hard to understand. Because they were engineers, because the ship needed them, because other people's lives depended on the light staying on. Their sacrifice led to changes, better watertight compartments, improved communication systems, more lifeboats. But no technology could replace what they represented. The willingness to put duty above self-preservation. The ripple of their true measure of their sacrifice isn't just in the statistics, it's in the lives that continued because of their choice. Every person who survived in those lifeboats owed their rescue, in part, to the engineers who kept the power on. Among the survivors was 2-year-old Lorraine Allison, one of only 2 children from first class who didn't survive. But her story represents hundreds of others who did. Every child pulled from those lifeboats, every mother reunited with family, every father who lived to see his children grow up, they all benefited from those precious extra minutes of light and power. Margaret Brown, the unsinkable Molly Brown, survived in lifeboat 6. She would go on to become a champion of workers' rights and women's suffrage. Her survival meant decades of advocacy for the very type of working-class heroes who saved her life. Eva Hart was just 7 years old when she survived in lifeboat 14. She lived to be 91, becoming one of the last survivors to share her memories. For 84 years, she carried the story of that night, including the story of the engineers who kept the lights burning. Eva later recalled, "I remember the lights. Even as we rowed away from the ship, the lights were still on. Mother said it meant there were still people working down there, still trying to save us all." The children who survived grew up to have children of their own. The mothers who lived raised families. The fathers who escaped continued their lines. Today, thousands of people around the world exist because 35 engineers chose duty over life on a cold April night in 1912. The ripple effect of heroism doesn't end with the rescue. It echoes through generations, through bloodlines, through the accumulated choices and achievements of all the lives that continued because of one moment of supreme sacrifice. The Last Minutes, a forensic construction based on survivor testimonies, physical evidence, and engineering analysis. We can reconstruct those final minutes in the engine room with heartbreaking precision. 2:15 a.m. The ship's list to starboard becomes severe. Water is pouring into multiple boiler rooms. Steam pressure is dropping rapidly, but the main electrical dynamos are still turning. To 16 a.m., the forward funnel collapses, killing several people in the water. Below, the engineers feel the massive vibration through the ship's structure. They know the end is very near. 2:17 a.m., the last lifeboat is in the water. The deck is awash. In the engine room, water has reached the main electrical switchboard. Herbert Harvey makes one final adjustment to keep the dynamos running just a little longer. 2:18 a.m., the lights flicker and dim throughout the ship. For a moment, it seems they might fail completely. Then, impossibly, they brighten again. Someone has managed to reroute power, squeeze a few more amperes from the dying system. This is the moment that defines their heroism. In the face of certain death, with water around their waist, they still found a way to restore power, still fought for those last precious seconds of light. 2:18 a.m., the final failure. One by one, the electrical systems fail. The lights go out, section by section, from bow to stern. The wireless falls silent. The pumps stop. In the engine room, 35 men stand in the darkness they had fought so hard to prevent. They had kept the lights on for 2 hours and 38 minutes. They had given everything they had to give, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was heroic. The Maritime Code War drove these men to make such an ultimate sacrifice. The answer lies in something deeper than duty, deeper than training. It lies in the ancient maritime code that has governed the behavior of seafarers for millennia. The sea is humanity's oldest enemy and greatest teacher. It has no mercy, no forgiveness, no second chances. Those who go to sea learn quickly that survival depends not on individual heroism, but on collective responsibility. Everyone's life depends on everyone doing their job. The code is unwritten but absolute. The ship and her passengers come first. Your own life is secondary. When the ship is in danger, you don't abandon your post. You fight for her until there's nothing left to fight with. This isn't just noble sentiment, it's practical wisdom born from thousands of years of maritime disasters. When the Birkenhead went down in 1852, the soldiers aboard maintained formation while women and children escaped in the boats. When the HMS Captain sank in 1870, Captain Hugh Burgoyne went down with his ship rather than abandon his command. The Titanic's engineers stood in this tradition, a brotherhood that transcends nationality, class, or era. They knew that their expertise, their knowledge, their ability to keep the machinery running was the difference between rescue and catastrophe. They also knew that someone had to be the last to leave, and someone had to stay until the very end. The Maritime Code demands it. Honor demands it. Love for their shipmates, for the strangers above, for the very idea of civilization itself, demands it. On that April night, they proved that the code still lived, still mattered, still had the power to transform ordinary men into legends. The investigation and recognition in the weeks and months following the disaster. Official inquiries on both sides of the Atlantic sought to understand what had happened and why. The heroism of the engineering staff was acknowledged, but the full story took decades to emerge. Official testimony stated, the engineering staff showed the highest devotion to duty. They remained at their posts and kept the electrical power functioning until the very end, enabling the safe launching of the lifeboats and the continued operation of the distress signals. But official recognition seemed inadequate compared to the magnitude of their sacrifice. How do you honor men who chose certain deaths so that others might live? How do you memorialize a decision that saved hundreds of lives? The Institution of Marine Engineers established a memorial fund for the families of the lost engineers. The city of Southampton, home to many of the crew, erected monuments, but perhaps the most fitting tribute came from their fellow engineers, a commitment to the same standards of duty and sacrifice. In maritime engineering, schools around the world, their story became legend. Young engineers learned not just about steam pressure and electrical systems, but about the moral weight of their profession. They learned that with expertise comes responsibility, and with responsibility comes the possibility of ultimate sacrifice. The Titanic's engineers didn't just die heroically, they lived heroically, and their example inspired generations of maritime professionals to hold themselves to the same impossible standard. The families left behind every act of heroism, is a family that pays the price. The engineers of the Titanic left behind wives, children, parents, and siblings who would spend the rest of their lives grappling with the meaning of their sacrifice. Joseph Bell's wife, Mary, received news of the disaster while caring for their young child. She would never remarry, carrying his memory for the rest of her life. She told their child stories of his father's courage, but she also carried the pain of a life cut short, dreams unfulfilled. Herbert Harvey had been engaged to be married. His fiancée kept their engagement ring until her death, never finding anyone who could match the standard he had set, not through his heroism, but through his character, his dedication, his love. The families received official condolences, small pensions, and the gratitude of strangers, but they also received something harder to bear: the knowledge that their loved ones had faced a choice and chosen duty over return. How do you explain to a child that daddy won't come home because he chose to save other people's daddies? How do you find pride in a sacrifice that leaves you alone? How do you honor a choice that breaks your heart? The families of the Titanic's engineers carried their own form of heroism, the heroism of living with loss, of finding meaning in tragedy, of raising children to understand that some things are worth dying for. Their pain was the other side of the engineers' courage, the price that love pays when duty calls. Modern parallels more than a century later, in an age of GPS navigation, satellite communication, and advanced safety systems, the story of the Titanic's engineers still resonates, because the fundamental equation hasn't changed. When disaster strikes, someone has to stay and fight. In 2012, when the Costa Concordia ran aground off the Italian coast, it was the engineers who stayed below to maintain power and ensure the safe evacuation of passengers. In countless maritime emergencies since 1912, engineers have followed the example set in the Titanic's engine room. But the principle extends beyond ships. Firefighters who enter burning buildings, nuclear technicians who contain radiation leaks, pilots who stay with damaged aircraft until their passengers are safe, they all embody the same spirit that drove Bell, Harvey, and their comrades. In our modern world, we sometimes forget that civilization depends on people willing to put others first. We live in the light and safety these sacrifices provide, often without knowing their cost. The Titanic's engineers remind us that behind every functioning system, every moment of safety, every rescue from disaster, there are people who have made the same choice: duty over self, service over survival, love over life. Their story isn't just history, it's a continuing testament to the best of human nature, playing out in emergency rooms and fire stations, in control towers and power plants, wherever people choose to serve something greater than themselves. The physics of sacrifice from an engineering perspective, what the Titanic's engine room crew accomplished in those final hours was nothing short of miraculous. The physics of their situation should have made their task impossible. As water flooded the lower compartments, it changed the ship's center of gravity, creating massive stress on the remaining machinery. The boilers, designed to operate level, were now tilting at dangerous angles. Steam pressure, which required precise water levels and controlled combustion, became increasingly difficult to maintain as the ship's angle increased. The electrical dynamos faced similar challenges. These massive machines were designed to operate within specific parameters of temperature, vibration, and position. As the ship tilted and water invaded their compartments, every minute they continued to function was a victory over physics itself. The engineers had to constantly adjust steam flow, reroute electrical loads, and compensate for the changing conditions. They were fighting not just the flood, but the fundamental laws of physics that govern how machinery operates. Consider the complexity. They had to maintain steam pressure in the remaining boilers while water flooded the furnaces. They had to keep electrical generators running while their foundations shifted beneath them. They had to coordinate the operation of pumps, lights, and communications while the ship literally broke apart around them. Each decision required instantaneous calculations of load, pressure, voltage, and structural integrity. They were performing advanced engineering under conditions that would challenge modern computer systems. The fact that they succeeded for nearly 3 hours is a testament not just to their courage, but to their extraordinary professional competence. They didn't just die heroically, they engineered heroically, solving impossible problems under impossible conditions, buying precious time with their expertise and their lives. The wireless continues. Perhaps no single element of their sacrifice was more crucial than keeping the wireless system operational. The Titanic's Marconi wireless set was her lifeline to the outside world, and it required constant electrical power to function. As the engineers fought to maintain the dynamos, they were literally keeping hope alive for everyone aboard. Senior wireless operator Jack Phillips and his junior colleague, Harold Bride, were sending increasingly desperate messages. Sekuda, Sekuda, Sos, Sekuda, come at once. We have struck a berg. It's a CQDOM, position 41.46, N 50.14. W. Every letter of those transmissions was powered by the sacrifice happening in the engine room below. The wireless signal reached ships across the North Atlantic, bringing the Carpathia racing to the rescue and alerting other vessels to the disaster. But the signal could only travel as long as the engineers could keep the electricity flowing. Phillips continued transmitting until the very end, reportedly sending his final message at 2:17 a.m., just 1 minute before the power finally failed. The engineers knew that the wireless was more than just communication. It was the difference between rescue and being lost forever in the vastness of the North Atlantic. Every additional minute of power meant a stronger chance that help was coming, that the lifeboats would be found, that their sacrifice would not be in vain. When the lights finally went out and the wireless fell silent, Phillips and Bride knew that below them, men had died to give them those last crucial minutes of transmission time. The rescue of the 710 survivors was made possible because the wireless had functioned until the very end, because the engineers had kept the power flowing long enough for help to be summoned and coordinates to be transmitted. Their technical expertise had been transformed into an instrument of salvation. The temperature of heroism, the physical conditions in the engine room during those final hours were beyond human endurance. Yet the engineers endured them. As the ship took on water, the temperature began to drop rapidly. The flooded compartments filled with seawater that was just above freezing 28 degrees Fahrenheit. But the engine room also contained sources of incredible heat. Boilers generating steam at over 400 degrees. Engines operating at full capacity. Electrical equipment producing their own thermal loads. This created a horrific environment of extremes. The engineers were working in spaces where freezing water was rising around boilers hot enough to kill instantly if touched. Steam pipes ran throughout the compartments, creating areas of scalding heat just feet away from pools of deadly cold water. The metal surfaces became treacherous, some hot enough to burn through clothing, others cold enough to freeze skin on contact. As the water rose higher, the engineers had to work in increasingly dangerous conditions. They were standing in water cold enough to induce hypothermia within minutes, while simultaneously managing equipment hot enough to cause fatal burns. Their hands, numb from cold, had to operate delicate controls and electrical switches with precision. Their minds, stressed by the knowledge of impending death, had to perform complex calculations and technical judgments. The physical courage required just to remain functional in such an environment is staggering. But they did more than remain functional. They excelled. They solved problems, made repairs, maintained systems. and coordinated their efforts with the calm professionalism that their training demanded. They transformed extreme physical adversity into an opportunity to demonstrate the highest levels of technical and moral excellence. The sound of sacrifice survivors in the lifeboats later described hearing the Titanic's final moments, the sounds that marked the end of the engineers' heroic stand. First came the mechanical sounds, steam escaping from relief valves, the groaning of metal under impossible stress, the irregular rhythm of machinery operating beyond its limits. These were the sounds of systems failing, of the engineers' battle being slowly lost to the inexorable rise of water. Then came the human sounds, shouted orders, coordinated responses, the calm professionalism of men doing their jobs under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Survivors reported that even in the final minutes, they could hear organized activity from deep within the ship, evidence that the engineers were still at their posts, still working, still fighting. The sound that marked the end came at 2:18 a.m. A sudden, profound silence as the electrical systems finally failed. The constant hum of dynamos, the rhythm of pumps, the whisper of steam through pipes, all went quiet at once. In the lifeboats, survivors knew that silence meant the end. The men below had finally lost their battle against the flood. The lights went out, and with them, 35 voices were silenced forever. But that silence also marked a victory. For 2 hours and 38 minutes, the sounds of their machinery had meant hope. Every minute those engines ran, every second those dynamos hummed, every moment those pumps operated. It all meant that someone was still fighting, still working, still refusing to give up. When the silence came, it came not because they had abandoned their posts, but because they had literally fought until there was nothing left to fight with. The legacy of lighting the century since the Titanic disaster. Maritime safety has been revolutionized. Ships now carry enough lifeboats for everyone aboard, maintain 24-hour radio watches, follow established shipping lanes, and use radar and GPS for navigation. Watertight compartments are more sophisticated. Emergency power systems are redundant and distributed, and international rescue coordination has been established. Much of this progress can be traced directly to lessons learned from the Titanic disaster and the heroism of her crew. But perhaps the most important legacy of the engineer's sacrifice is less tangible, but more enduring. The understanding that some responsibilities cannot be abandoned, no matter the cost. In maritime academies around the world, future officers and engineers study not just the technical aspects of the disaster, but the moral examples set by Bell, Harvey, Hesketh, and their comrades. They learn that expertise carries with it an obligation to serve others, even unto death. This lesson has been carried forward by generations of maritime professionals who have faced their own moments of crisis. During World War II, merchant mariners kept their engines running while under attack by submarines and aircraft. During modern disasters like the Costa Concordia grounding or the Estonia ferry sinking, engineers have stayed below to maintain power and assist in evacuations. The tradition established in the Titanic's engine room lives on in the quiet heroism of professionals who understand that their skills and knowledge are not just career assets, but sacred trusts. The light that the Titanic's engineers kept burning for those crucial hours continues to shine. It illuminates not just the physical spaces where people work and live in safety, but the moral landscape that defines what it means to serve others. Their sacrifice reminds us that civilization depends on people who are willing to put duty before self-preservation, expertise before self-interest, and love before life itself. The final calculation in the end. The story of the Titanic's engine room comes down to a simple equation that these 35 men solved with their lives. How much are other people's lives worth? Their answer was everything. Everything they had, everything they were, everything they might have become. They calculated the value of 2,200 lives against their own 35, and they found the mathematics of sacrifice to be overwhelmingly clear. But their calculation went deeper than numbers. They weighed their personal dreams against the dreams of others, their individual hopes against collective survival, their own futures against the future of civilization itself. And in that moment of ultimate choice, when they could have saved themselves by abandoning their posts, they chose to stay. They chose to serve. They chose to sacrifice. Their choice reminds us that heroism is not just about grand gestures or dramatic moments. It's about the quiet decision to do what's right when everything else is falling apart. It's about maintaining professional standards when professionalism itself seems meaningless. It's about keeping the lights on when darkness is overwhelming everything else. In those final minutes, as water rose around them and death approached with mechanical certainty, the engineers of the RMS Titanic proved that some things are more important than life itself. They proved that duty and honor are not just words, but principles worth dying for. They proved that love for strangers, love for the idea of service, love for the belief that some responsibilities cannot be abandoned is the most powerful force in the human heart. Their lights went out at 2:18 a.m. on April 15, 1912, but the light of their example burns on, illuminating the darkness, showing us what it means to be truly human in the face of ultimate adversity. They kept the lights on when it mattered most, and in doing so, they lit a flame that will never be extinguished.